to today's session where we are presenting and talking about the NALDIC and British Council audits on EAL training. I'm just going to open by saying a little bit about the audits and setting some of the context, but hand over to our two distinguished speakers who are experts in the field and know a great deal more about this area than I do. Many of you know the Bell Foundation, but for those of you who don't, just briefly, we are a Cambridge-based charitable foundation working in two thematic areas: children with English as an additional language, doing research, practical partnerships and practical programs with schools, and we're partnering with NALDIC and with EAL Nexus, as well as research partnership with Cambridge University and also with a number of other smaller research partnerships with universities. We also have a programme in the offenders sector, which is practical programmes with partners working with offenders. I'd like to move on now to talk about some of the key high-level findings from the audits and then pass over into to colleagues for a much more detailed presentation. I don't usually open presentations like this with an anecdote, but my daughter came home from school 2 days ago and she's 14 and she said, "Mum, there's a new girl who started at school today in our class and she's 14 and she speaks Arabic and she can't speak a word of English." So I said, "Oh, how is it?" And she said, "Well, we're all including her in our games and our break time." So I said, "That was quite nice to hear." And then she said, "But the school's just handed her a dictionary and the teachers are just using Google Translate." And then I went to my desk and I reread the audits and I found Google Translate is widely used. A lot of unqualified teachers of EAL, a very weak knowledge of language at secondary level, local authorities still the main provider, only a third of training sustained over more than one term, only 12% accredited. Many teachers experience only very short twilight sessions, and there's no consistent national framework. And from our own experience with the partnership schools we're working with, it's the Polish PE teacher or the Lithuanian mum, and some people very, very motivated and engaged, but lacking any detailed understanding of language. And what was concerning was to find that this is borne out by the two audits we have here today. I'd like to put this in its wider national public policy context. Everybody knows this slide, but I never take it out of presentations because it continues to have a reaction in audiences. Continuous upward trend and doubled over the last 10 years, but at the same time, the public policy context narrowing and changing. Policy and reality, you will probably know these quotes too. This is obviously from the DFE. Pupils learning EAL are generally taught in the mainstream alongside their peers. 3 years and additional support from the point of entry should be sufficient for pupils with the EAL. And most linguists would agree it may take 7 or more years to achieve academic parity with monolingual peers, and this is reasonably well evidenced. So the starting point for students with English as an additional language is radically different from that of other students. I think one of the things that struck me most strongly from the audits was that schools are not accountable for this expenditure in the way they are with pupil premium funding, and I think this is a major recommendation that we as the sector should be articulating, because there is dedicated funding, albeit not ring-fenced, but there isn't the accountability. And this is an interesting contrast with the free school meal pupil premium money, that the schools are expected to report on that. National curriculum guidance states teachers must take account of the needs of pupils whose first language is not English, and their ability to take part may be in advance of their communication skills in English. I think all of us in this room must reflect that we are actually working in a fairly toxic external context. And I would challenge specialists and people who are very focused on does this pedagogy work or does this pedagogy work, to situate this in a much bigger picture. This is not unique to a pre-election context. Some of these headlines are from 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and you can open the paper and you can see a continuation of these headlines. Schools forced to splurge on teaching pupils English. Britain's schools need more resources for influx of immigrant children, Chief Inspector warns. Immigration is changing the character of UK schools, claims Ian Duncan-Smith, and schools where English is foreign to all pupils. This is the climate that we are operating in externally, and the other obviously important context for this is actually the climate is now very devolved. So you have a number of different ways. You have local authorities, you have academy change, you have free schools, you have very, very many different actors in the school environment. It's much less homogenous. So I think we can sum up the current situation in the UK as 1 million, over 1 million EAL students, 630 languages, number has doubled in over 10 years. No EAL discipline in initial teacher education, patchy and inconsistent continuous professional development, no official credential for EAL teachers, mixed practice within schools, some very, very good practice, no dedicated EAL curriculum, not always initial language level assessment, and assessment designed for native speakers. The policy context, there is no national policy context on this issue now. Very limited educational research on EAL learners. And the policy context is now highly devolved, and I think again we must challenge ourselves to think about, does that actually mean that it is realistic to advocate national solutions? And as I said also, it is a very, very politicised context. I think looking ahead in the external context to 2015 and beyond, so obviously the Carter Review of Initial Teacher Education, with quite limited mention of English as an additional language, that was published earlier this week, but with some very interesting hooks on which we can build. There's obviously a general election, and the complexity of a new coalition is even the pollsters can't predict what this will look like, so we shouldn't really try. But I think some things we can say will continue are very highly devolved characteristics around the delivery of teacher training. Continued local authority funding cuts, and the days of Section 11 and grants, these are long gone, and there will be more cuts whoever gets into power. And much more continued diversification of provisions. So working in this space, we're in quite a challenging external climate, and I think we really need the sector to work together on finding solutions. Just a few headlines of the Carter Review, which some of you may have read. This isn't by any means all of it, and I'm sure Mark, our speaker, may be able to give some more detail, but one of the recommendations, DFE should commission a sector body to develop a framework of core content for ITT. So this may be something on which we can build. A central portal of synthesised summaries on practical advice on research findings, again, potentially something on which to build. Assessment, including theories of assessment and technical aspects of assessment, should be part of a framework for ITT content. So again, potentially something on which we can build. And the only EAL example that I found was the example of Sheffield Hallam and the placements in both special needs and EAL from that case study. So it does get a mention, which was encouraging. To move to the objectives really of today's seminar, there will be a presentation from our two speakers on the training audits, a response from Mark Sims from Ofsted, discussion and questions, and then some concluding observations. And I'd really encourage you in the discussion and question time not to think about problems, but to think about solutions. I think there's the fairly universal agreement on what the problem is, but actually how do we go forward? And with no more from me, I would like now to hand over to Nicola Davis.